They buried it under the word invasive. A plant that produces 12 tons of edible tubers per hectare without replanting, survives winter freezes that kill grain stores, requires no irrigation infrastructure, and delivers more calories per square meter than rice under siege conditions, was reclassified from strategic famine reserve to noxious weed. Sunchokes, Jerusalem artichokes, Helianthus tuberosus. It fed populations through blockades when rice shipments stopped. It grew in frozen ground when wheat fields turned to mud. It stored itself underground when armies burned granaries. And by 1970, it had been systematically removed from every major agricultural subsidy program in the Western Hemisphere, not because it failed, because it succeeded without the system. Before French colonists renamed it, before it was banned in municipal codes, before USDA guides listed it under invasive species, indigenous populations across the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Basin cultivated sunchokes as winter subsistence infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from pre-Columbian sites in Ontario and Illinois shows deliberate propagation corridors extending over 200 kilometers. These weren't gardens. They were caloric security networks. French Jesuit records from 1605 describe Algonquin communities harvesting tubers through February snow. Storage methods that required no cellars, no preservation salts, no drying infrastructure. The plant stored itself. Samuel de Champlain's expedition notes detail sunchoke density in cultivated zones exceeding wild populations by 14:1. This was managed agriculture. Tubers remained viable underground for 8 months. They didn't rot. They didn't require harvest labor in autumn. They waited. When spring famine periods hit northern tribes, when stored corn ran out, when hunting failed, communities returned to sunchoke patches and extracted calories directly from frozen soil. French colonists called them roots that saved us. By 1650, French agronomists had transported sunchokes to Europe specifically as famine insurance. The logistics were incompatible with administrative collapse. Rice requires milling infrastructure. Wheat needs threshing, grinding, storage facilities that rodents and moisture destroy. Corn demands autumn harvest windows and dry granaries. Sunchokes required nothing. Plant fragments in spring. Ignore until needed. Tubers multiplied underground without human intervention. A single forgotten tuber regenerated an entire patch. There was no harvest failure. If you didn't dig them up, they remained viable through winter and produced again next season. Yield increased annually without replanting. French agricultural manuals from the 1690s describe sunchoke plots maintained for 15 consecutive years with zero inputs, no ploughing, no seeding, no weeding. The plant suppressed competing growth through sheer density. Nutritional content per 100 grams of raw tuber, 73 calories, primarily inulin-based carbohydrates that human digestion converts slowly, preventing blood sugar collapse during rationing. Protein content low, but adequate for caloric bulking. The strategic value wasn't nutritional complexity, it was caloric availability when complex supply chains shattered. In 1845, Phytophthora infestans destroyed Irish potato crops. 4 years of consecutive failures, over 1 million dead, another 2 million displaced. British administrative records show something else. Private estates in counties Wexford and Cork that had planted sunchokes as experimental crops in the 1830s maintained household food security through 1849. These weren't wealthy estates with grain imports. They were middling properties that had adopted French agricultural techniques after Napoleonic wars. Estate account books show no purchased food during peak famine years. Tuber harvest records show consistent yields between 1845 and 1850. The blight that killed potatoes didn't touch sunchokes, different genus, different vulnerabilities, but there was no systematic expansion, no government program to distribute sunchoke cuttings. The crop that survived the famine remained confined to experimental plots, while millions starved 10 kilometers away. It wasn't unknown, it wasn't untested, it wasn't unavailable. It was unscalable under export-oriented land use policy. Sunchokes couldn't be shipped to England. They degraded rapidly after harvest. They had to be eaten locally. During the siege of Leningrad, between 1941 and 1944, when Wehrmacht forces encircled the city and cut supply lines, Soviet survival manuals distributed through civil defense networks included instructions for locating and harvesting sunchoke patches that had naturalized in pre-war suburban gardens. Diaries from survivors describe digging through snow in February to extract frozen tubers. Caloric intake records show sunchokes provided supplemental calories to roughly 40,000 civilians during the worst months. They grew in bombed lots. They required no intact agricultural infrastructure. The siege that killed rice supplies, that turned wheat stores into strategic military targets, that made every granary a bombing priority, couldn't eliminate tubers buried 40 centimeters underground in frozen soil. Compare water requirements. Rice cultivation demands flooding. 1 kilogram of rice requires approximately 2,500 liters of water. Sunchokes require ambient rainfall. No irrigation infrastructure. Comparative land use efficiency under drought conditions shows sunchokes producing 7,300 calories per square meter with zero irrigation versus rice, producing 4,200 calories per square meter under optimal flooding. In collapse scenarios where water infrastructure fails, where canal systems break, where fuel for pumps runs out, rice becomes impossible. Sunchokes continue. Carbon emissions per calorie produced show mechanized rice agriculture, generating 0.004 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per calorie, when including methane release from flooded paddies. Sunchokes generate 0.001 kilograms, mostly from initial soil disturbance, a quarter of the impact. But subsidy structures don't calculate collapse resilience, they calculate export tonnage. Between 1970 and 2020, U.S. federal agricultural subsidies directed $412 billion toward corn, wheat, rice, and soy. Directed toward sunchokes, zero. Not reduced funding, zero. The USDA categorizes sunchokes under specialty crops without support infrastructure. State agricultural extensions in 17 states list them as species requiring management intervention. Management means eradication. Modern studies confirm what siege populations knew. A 2019 analysis published in the Journal of Agricultural Science compared nutrient density and yield stability of 12 staple crops under simulated infrastructure collapse. Sunchokes ranked second in caloric production without inputs, behind only cassava. But cassava requires tropical conditions. Sunchokes survive in USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9. That's Minnesota to Georgia, Montreal to Mississippi. They grow where 73% of the North American population lives. The study modeled supply chain interruption scenarios: no fuel for machinery, no fertilizer imports, no pesticide application, no irrigation. Rice yields dropped 68%. Wheat dropped 71%. Corn dropped 82%. Sunchoke yields dropped 9%. The 9% reduction came from lack of harvest optimization, not crop failure. The tubers still grew. Research from the University of Manitoba demonstrated sunchoke cold tolerance down to -40 degrees Celsius while dormant. The tubers froze solid and resumed growth when thawed. Rice seeds lose viability at -2 degrees, wheat at -5. The crops that feed 8 billion people can't survive a freezer. The crop that fed populations through sieges can survive permafrost. The system didn't ban sunchokes through legislation. It reclassified them through language. Agricultural extension documents describe spread patterns as aggressive and difficult to control. These are identical characteristics that make them reliable during collapse. They grow without human management and regenerate from fragments. But reliable became invasive. Persistent became noxious. Self-perpetuating became problematic. City ordinances in municipalities across Ontario, Michigan, and Wisconsin prohibit planting sunchokes on residential properties, citing concerns about spread into adjacent lots. The legal framework that prevents suburban cultivation of a plant that produces food without inputs mirrors frameworks applied to amaranth, to cattails, to groundnuts. All of them are higher calorie or higher protein than subsidized crops. All of them grow with minimal intervention. All of them were staple foods for pre-industrial populations. All of them are now classified under invasive species management. The classification isn't botanical, it's economic. Plants that don't require annual seed purchases, that don't need fertilizer shipments, that don't demand machinery operation, fall outside industrial agriculture's revenue model. They're not profitable to scale. So they're scaled out of language, regulation, and subsidy access. No corporation patents sunchokes because you can't prevent regeneration from a fragment left in soil. Seed companies don't sell them because customers would never need to buy again. The pattern repeats across continuums. Amaranth was a staple grain for Aztec populations, producing protein content higher than wheat, growing in arid conditions where corn failed. Spanish colonial administration banned its cultivation and burned fields, not because it was nutritionally inferior, but because its role in indigenous ritual made it a threat to cultural reorganization. The agricultural justification came later. Weedy growth habit. Groundnuts, Apios americana, were documented by Lewis and Clark as indigenous staple food across the Missouri River Basin, producing tubers with 17% protein content compared to potatoes at 2%. By 1920, USDA guides listed groundnuts under wild foods, removing them from agricultural development. Cattails, Typha species, produce rhizomes with carbohydrate density comparable to rice and grow in wetlands without cultivation. Wetland drainage subsidies between 1930 and 1980 eliminated 90 million acres of cattail habitat across North America, converting them to corn and soy fields that require annual planting. Every high-calorie, low-input plant that fed populations before industrial monoculture follows the same trajectory: reclassification from food to weed, removal from subsidy access, elimination from agricultural research priorities, erasure from food culture. The future isn't uncertain. Climate models show increasing drought frequency across current rice-growing regions in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Projections indicate 30% yield reduction in rice by 2050 under median warming scenarios. Aquifer depletion in the Punjab and the North China Plain will make flood irrigation impossible within 2 decades. Rice feeds 3.5 billion people. When the water runs out, those 3.5 billion will need calories that grow without flooding. Sunchokes are already adapted. They're waiting in abandoned lots, in ditches along rural roads, in forgotten garden corners. The knowledge of how to use them isn't in USDA databases. It's in French agricultural texts from the 1600s. It's in Leningrad siege diaries. It's in Irish estate records that nobody synthesized into policy. The crop that survives collapse has already been removed from the infrastructure that would distribute it. There are no sunchoke seed banks in federal reserves, no breeding programs optimizing yield, no extension agents teaching cultivation. When the rice system breaks, the replacement crop will have to be rediscovered by populations who were taught it was a weed. The siege crop, the famine insurance, the tuber that waited underground while empires restructured agriculture around exports. It never left. It was just renamed until people forgot it was food. If this vault revealed what they erased from the fields, subscribe to recover what the system buried. Knowledge survives only when it's remembered. The next archive opens soon.